Winter pressed its pale mouth against the windows of Ashbourne House, whitening the lawns and silencing the distant village, yet inside the Duke's ancestral seat the world glittered with warmth and privilege. Chandeliers burned like captive constellations above a ballroom scented with beeswax and hothouse flowers, and silk gowns whispered across the parquet floor as though even fabric knew to speak softly in the presence of power. This was the season when rank gathered to admire itself, and when those who served that admiration learned anew how small their place truly was. Miss Eleanor Hart stood at the margin of this brightness, precisely where a woman like her was meant to stand. She was a gentlewoman by birth and education, though not by fortune, and so occupied that ambiguous position peculiar to the age, neither servant nor equal, welcomed yet never invited. As a temporary lady's companion to the Duke's widowed cousin, she existed to listen, to assist, and above all to disappear. Her gown was modest but well kept, her gloves carefully mended, her posture disciplined by years of knowing that dignity was the last possession no creditor could seize. The Duke of Ashbourne observed his guests from the far end of the room, a figure carved by inheritance rather than effort. His title stretched back through centuries of monarchs and wars, and his manner bore the easy confidence of a man never required to explain himself. He was known at court as reliable, loyal, and formidable, a landowner whose loyalty to the crown was rewarded with influence that reached quietly into Parliament and the royal household alike. To him, order was not merely desirable, it was natural, and those who disrupted it did so at their peril. The slight disturbance that evening began as such things often did, with nothing more dramatic than a request. Eleanor had been asked to locate a misplaced fan for her employer, and in the course of that errand she crossed the Duke's path near the withdrawing room, where gentlemen lingered over port and self-importance. She waited, as etiquette required, until he finished speaking, then addressed him with a respectful inclination of her head. Her voice was calm, her words precise, but the interruption itself, however small, pricked his patience. He answered her curtly, and when she clarified her purpose, a flicker of irritation sharpened his tone. Others were listening. A few smiles hovered, anticipating diversion. The Duke, accustomed to command and amused by his own authority, allowed himself a remark intended to restore the proper balance. "You mistake your importance," he said lightly, though his eyes were cold. "I can hire 60 like you before luncheon." The words fell into the room with a peculiar finality, not loud enough to be called a scene, yet clear enough to wound. Eleanor felt the familiar heat of shame rise, swift and treacherous, as it always did when reminded of her dependence. She had heard variations of such sentiments before, uttered with sympathy or contempt, but never so publicly, never by a man whose favor could shape futures with a gesture. For a breath, the old instincts urged her toward silence, toward gratitude for employment and invisibility. Instead, something steadied within her. Perhaps it was exhaustion, or perhaps the quiet certainty that there were injuries no position could justify. She met his gaze, and in that moment the disparity between them seemed almost absurd. A duke in velvet and a woman in borrowed respectability, equal only in their humanity. "Then do it, your grace," she replied, her voice level, stripped of ornament. "I resign my position." She inclined her head once more, not in submission but in closure, and turned away. The silence that followed was absolute. Conversation stalled, fans paused mid-air, and the soft music from the adjoining room faltered as though uncertain of its duty. Eleanor walked through the corridor with measured steps, each one carrying her further from security and closer to uncertainty, yet she did not falter. She collected her gloves, informed her astonished employer with brief courtesy, and retired to her chamber to prepare for departure before dawn, as propriety demanded. Elsewhere in the house, whispers began their restless work. What had been said, what had been meant, and how dangerous it was for a woman to refuse her place became subjects of avid speculation. The Duke himself remained where he was, the sting of her words settling slowly into something like disbelief. No one had ever left him so cleanly, without tears or negotiation. He dismissed the gathering soon after, attributing his mood to fatigue, yet found no rest when the house finally slept. As Eleanor packed her few belongings, she felt the weight of consequence settle upon her shoulders, heavy but oddly clarifying. By morning she would be without patronage, her name vulnerable to distortion, her future uncertain in a society unforgiving of female independence. Still, as the candle burned low, she allowed herself one small defiant thought, that for the first time in many years, she had chosen herself. Outside, the snow continued to fall, erasing tracks and disguising paths, as if the world itself conspired to offer no easy return, only forward motion into whatever awaited next. In the servants' corridors, the story already shifted shape, gaining color and intent with each retelling, until Eleanor Hart became either heroine or caution, depending on the listener's fears. By the time the first carriage was ordered at dawn, Ashbourne House held the charged stillness of a place altered by a single ungovernable moment. The Duke, staring into the grey light creeping over his estate, sensed without yet understanding that authority, once questioned, could never return unchanged. What had begun as an idle cruelty had opened a breach, and through it stirred consequences neither rank nor wealth could wholly command, consequences that would follow them both beyond the frozen grounds. History, patient and unblinking, had taken note, and it would not be so easily dismissed. Nor conscience slept quietly. London received Eleanor Hart as it did most inconvenient truths, with curiosity disguised as concern and judgment softened only by distance. By the time her carriage reached the narrow street where she had taken modest lodgings, the story had already preceded her, altered by whispers yet unmistakable in its core. A woman had defied a duke. Such a fact could not be ignored, only interpreted, and society set eagerly to the task. Some praised her composure, others condemned her presumption, but all agreed that she had committed an error for which there could be no easy remedy. Eleanor herself moved quietly through those first days, acutely aware that visibility was both danger and necessity. She renewed acquaintances carefully, seeking temporary work that would not demand explanation, and spent long hours walking the winter streets, observing shop windows and faces with the practiced restraint of someone accustomed to being overlooked. Yet beneath her calm lay the persistent ache of uncertainty, for every invitation withheld and every polite evasion reminded her how swiftly reputation could dissolve. She did not regret her choice, but she understood its cost with a clarity sharpened by cold mornings and unanswered letters. At Ashbourne House, the Duke discovered that authority, once exercised without thought, had a habit of returning in altered form. He was questioned, delicately but persistently, by relatives and political allies who sensed danger in disorder. His cousin, affronted and anxious, demanded explanations he could not easily supply. He found himself repeating the incident in his mind, not as justification but as examination, troubled by the memory of Eleanor's composure more than by her departure. That she had not pleaded or protested unsettled him profoundly, for it denied him the familiar comfort of superiority. The first token was dispatched almost without conscious decision. A letter, formally worded and impeccably sealed, was sent to her lodgings under the guise of rectifying a misunderstanding. It offered regret without apology, assistance without acknowledgment of fault, and the possibility of future employment arranged discreetly through his influence. Eleanor read it twice, noting the careful balance between courtesy and control, then returned it unopened, instructing the boy who had delivered it that no reply was required. The act was small, yet it reverberated, carried back to the Duke as a refusal more eloquent than any reproach. Whispers grew sharper after that. It was said she had designs above her station, that she had been dismissed rather than resigned, that the Duke's interest proved her ambition. None of these versions satisfied Eleanor, yet she learned to bear them with outward indifference, knowing that correction only lent them strength. She took a short-term position copying correspondence for a retired solicitor, work that preserved her anonymity while barely sustaining her independence. In the evenings, she read by lamplight, drawing solace from the constancy of printed words when human judgment proved unreliable. The Duke's second gesture was less restrained. Through a mutual acquaintance, he arranged for a place to be offered to Eleanor within a respected household, one whose patronage would secure her future beyond question. This time, the offer was accompanied by explicit assurances of safety and respect, as though he sought to prove his benevolence by proxy. Eleanor considered it longer, weighing prudence against principle, before declining with a brief note expressing gratitude and finality. She sensed that acceptance would bind her invisibly to him, and she would not exchange one form of dependence for another. At court, the matter acquired a different texture. Such disturbances were rarely isolated, and those charged with maintaining decorum took notice. Questions were posed quietly, not of Eleanor directly but of the Duke's discretion and judgment. His loyalty to the crown was unquestioned, yet loyalty did not excuse carelessness, especially when it risked provoking sympathy for defiance. He was advised, gently but firmly, to resolve the situation in a manner that discouraged imitation. The warning unsettled him more than any gossip, for it framed his private discomfort as a public concern. Eleanor sensed the change in the air before she understood its source. Invitations ceased altogether, even from those who had once relied upon her quiet competence. She was not shunned openly, but absence itself became a language she learned to interpret. Still, there were moments of unexpected kindness, a bookseller who extended credit, a former school friend who pressed her hand in silent encouragement. These gestures did not erase her precariousness, yet they reminded her that society was not a single voice, however loudly it spoke. One afternoon, as she returned from an errand, Eleanor encountered the Duke's carriage halted by congestion in the street. Their eyes met through the glass, and for a heartbeat the world narrowed to that accidental intimacy. He inclined his head, not as master to dependent but as one equal acknowledging another, and she responded with the same measured courtesy. The carriage moved on, leaving behind a disturbance she felt long after, not of fear but of recognition. He had seen her, truly, and the knowledge unsettled them both. That evening, she received word that an inquiry had been made regarding her conduct, not accusatory yet undeniably intrusive. The implications were clear. Her independence was being weighed against propriety, her silence mistaken for opportunity. Eleanor understood then that the matter could not remain suspended indefinitely. By walking away, she had altered the narrative, but she had not escaped it. Somewhere between scandal and silence, a reckoning waited, and she would be required to meet it without armor beyond her own resolve. The Duke, pacing his library under the watchful eyes of his ancestors' portraits, came to a parallel understanding. Influence could open doors, but it could not compel respect, and without respect his gestures rang hollow. He realized, with a clarity both unwelcome and inevitable, that his fascination was no longer rooted in wounded pride but in a growing awareness of her strength. The thought that she might be forced into submission by forces he himself represented troubled him deeply. As night settled over London, both stood at the edge of consequence, aware that their next actions would define not only reputation but character. The scandal had not peaked. It had merely drawn breath, preparing for a turn neither yet foresaw, but both, in quieter moments, anticipated. Rain softened London into a blur of slate and silver on the afternoon Eleanor Hart received the message requesting her presence at the Duke of Ashbourne's townhouse. The wording was impeccable, neither commanding nor pleading, and it acknowledged her freedom to refuse, yet she understood at once that refusal would only prolong the tension now coiled tightly around her name. She prepared carefully, choosing a gown plain enough to discourage comment yet well fitted enough to assert self-respect, and stepped into the damp street with the composure of a woman accustomed to carrying her fate quietly. The house itself reflected its owner's temperament, austere in stone yet warmed within by polished wood and disciplined luxury. Eleanor was shown into a private library where firelight glimmered against shelves heavy with leather-bound volumes, and there she waited, attentive to the measured ticking of the clock and the steadiness of her own breathing. When the Duke entered, he did so without ceremony, dismissing the servant with a nod before turning to face her. For a moment neither spoke, as though language itself required careful selection after so much had been said without words. He began at last, acknowledging the impropriety of summoning her and accepting responsibility for the discomfort it might cause. His voice was controlled, yet beneath its restraint she detected an unfamiliar hesitation. Eleanor listened without interruption, noting the effort it cost him to articulate sentiments he had never been required to examine. He did not defend his remark nor excuse it as humor. Instead, he named it as thoughtless, an admission that surprised her more than any apology could have done. When he finished, the silence returned, altered now by expectation. Eleanor answered with the same deliberate calm she had summoned at Ashbourne House, yet her tone carried a new firmness shaped by experience rather than shock. She spoke of the realities of dependence, of the careful balance women like her maintained between usefulness and invisibility, and of how easily dignity could be stripped away by a single careless phrase. She did not accuse him of cruelty so much as ignorance, a distinction that required courage to sustain. As she spoke, the Duke felt the ground shift beneath assumptions he had never questioned, and the sensation was both unsettling and clarifying. He confessed then that her refusal of his offers had forced him into an unfamiliar humility. Accustomed to being obeyed or forgiven, he had been confronted instead with indifference, a boundary he could not cross without consent. He admitted admiration for her resolve, though he stopped short of naming the deeper pull he felt, perhaps fearing it would compromise the seriousness of his intent. Eleanor regarded him steadily, aware that admiration without understanding could become another form of possession if left unexamined. The conversation turned toward the pressure now gathering beyond the room, the quiet scrutiny of court and society, and the likelihood that Eleanor's independence would be challenged under the guise of propriety. The Duke did not pretend he was exempt from this machinery. Indeed, he acknowledged that his own influence had contributed to its vigilance. Yet he offered something different now, not patronage disguised as rescue, but transparency. He would not intervene without her consent, nor would he deny his part if questioned. The choice, he insisted, must remain hers. Eleanor considered this carefully, recognizing the rarity of such restraint. She admitted her fear, not of poverty, but of being compelled into silence by narratives she could not control. She had walked away once to preserve herself, yet she could not do so endlessly without consequence. In this shared vulnerability, an intimacy formed that was neither romantic nor strategic, but rooted in mutual recognition. They were, for the first time, speaking not as Duke and dependent, but as individuals navigating the same uncertain terrain. When she rose to leave, the Duke did not attempt to detain her. Instead, he offered his word, plainly given, that he would respect her decision whatever it proved to be. Eleanor accepted this promise with a nod that carried neither gratitude nor suspicion, only acknowledgment. As she stepped back into the rain, she felt the peculiar steadiness that followed honesty, even when its implications were unresolved. The encounter had not solved her difficulties, yet it had clarified them, and clarity itself was a form of power. The Duke remained in the library long after her departure, conscious of a shift he could neither reverse nor ignore. He had knelt, metaphorically, before principle rather than pride, and the act had altered him in ways that defied easy articulation. He understood now that influence divorced from conscience was brittle, and that the woman who had challenged him had done so not to provoke, but to survive intact. The realization carried both relief and danger. By evening, rumors of the meeting had already begun to circulate, their outlines indistinct yet suggestive. Eleanor, returning to her lodgings, sensed that her privacy was narrowing, that choice itself was becoming a visible act. Still, she felt no regret for attending, only a sharpened awareness that the path ahead demanded resolve equal to any she had yet shown. The Duke, watching the rain streak his windows, understood the same. Their lives, once parallel but separate, had intersected irrevocably, and from that crossing consequences would unfold that neither rank nor restraint could wholly contain. Morning broke with a thin golden light that fell across London's rooftops, and with it came decision. Eleanor Hart stood at her window, watching the city stir, aware that waiting had ceased to be a neutral act. Silence now invited interpretation, and interpretation threatened to become judgment. She understood that her future would soon be decided by whether she allowed others to speak for her. The choice before her was not romantic, but moral, and it required courage of a public kind she had never sought. Once made, it would alter every remaining hour of her life irrevocably and forever. The Duke of Ashbourne arrived at court that afternoon with a resolve hardened by sleepless nights. He had listened to warnings framed as advice, and recognized in them the old fear of disorder. Yet for once, obedience felt like cowardice. When questioned about the matter, he spoke plainly, neither defensive nor contrite, and accepted responsibility for his words. The admission carried risk, but also authority, and those listening heard something unusual, a man placing principle above convenience. It was noted, remembered, and quietly measured for its consequences without retraction or apology. Eleanor was summoned soon after, not by command but by invitation, and she accepted knowing visibility could no longer be avoided. The assembly was small, its formality muted, yet the attention upon her felt keen. She spoke only when addressed, her voice steady, her manner unapologetic. She neither denied the incident nor embellished it, insisting simply upon the right to decline humiliation. In doing so, she claimed no martyrdom, only personhood, a distinction that unsettled those accustomed to silence. The effect was restrained, yet undeniably transformative for all present and carried beyond the chamber into waiting society at large outside. The Duke watched her from across the room, aware that any gesture from him might tilt opinion. He did nothing, and that restraint proved its own statement. Later, when they spoke privately, his words were few and carefully chosen. He did not offer protection, but partnership, not salvation, but steadfastness. Eleanor considered him with the same honesty she demanded of herself, testing his resolve against the memory of injury. She found change, not perfection, and judged that enough to risk belief. Trust, she knew, was not granted, but practiced daily with vigilance and mutual accountability within unequal worlds still standing. The public response was measured, neither celebratory nor condemning, yet the absence of outrage itself signaled change. Eleanor received an offer of employment on terms she had helped define, independent of the Duke's authority. She accepted, aware that work would not erase scrutiny, but it restored balance. The Duke, for his part, stood by her publicly without claiming her, a gesture that surprised even him. Their connection remained unannounced, sustained instead by consistency, respect, and patience. Affection grew quietly where entitlement once ruled, altering expectations on both sides without spectacle, yet with lasting consequence for their futures and names alike. In time, conversation replaced conjecture, and the incident that had threatened ruin settled into memory. Eleanor did not become an example often invoked, which was its own victory. She lived with modest security, her days shaped by purpose rather than fear. The Duke found that influence tempered by conscience strengthened his standing, and he carried that lesson forward. They met as equals whenever circumstance allowed, neither hiding nor displaying what bound them. The world adjusted, slowly, to a balance it had not anticipated and found itself intact, though quietly reshaped by restraint and courage practiced without applause or reward alone. The story, when retold, lost its sharpest edges, yet its meaning endured. A woman had walked away, and had not been destroyed. A man had listened, and had not been diminished. Such outcomes were rare, but they were possible. Eleanor and the Duke understood that their happiness did not require triumph, only continuance. They chose deliberately, again and again, to honor the moment that had first tested them. In doing so, they preserved its lesson rather than its drama, which proved far more durable across years and shifting seasons of public memory and private understanding earned together through time alone. Years later, when the house at Ashbourne stood quiet beneath summer skies, Eleanor walked its gardens without hesitation. She had not been absorbed by its grandeur, nor had she lost herself. The Duke joined her there, his manner gentler, his authority untarnished. They spoke of ordinary matters, finding in their ease the truest measure of change. No spectators witnessed this quiet resolution, yet it endured more surely than any public display. The past no longer commanded them. It merely informed their choices with humility, affection, and respect hard-won over trials endured together in full awareness of consequence and choice. If asked what had changed, Eleanor might have answered that nothing essential had. She had always valued herself, though once the world had tested that valuation. The difference now was simple: she no longer stood alone. The Duke, if asked, might have said the same, for power had not left him, but it had learned to listen. Between them, respect had grown where silence once reigned, and in that space affection found room. Such outcomes rarely announce themselves, yet they alter history quietly through lives lived differently after moments of courage and restraint chosen without guarantee or applause from anyone. Their story ended without spectacle, as most true changes do. No anthem marked it, no proclamation secured it, yet it held. A woman kept her dignity, a man earned his, and together they proved that respect could reshape inheritance. The world continued much as before, but for them, and for those who noticed, something fundamental had shifted. They lived forward, mindful of the moment that began it all, when one sentence met another and refused to be forgotten. Its echo lingered, not as scandal, but as quiet resolve guiding their days thereafter with patience and mutual regard intact and enduring.